Thank you, Gary, for such a nice introduction. I'm going to be talking then about what's the book about. So the book is interested in the link between growth, employment, and poverty in Latin America. And as Gary said, the main question of the book is, has economic growth resulted in economic development by improving the labor market conditions in the 2000s? So this is saying that we are going to look at what happened when economic growth takes place, what happened with the labor market indicators during the 2000s. And what happened with these improvements or with these changes with the economic crisis of 2008. And if different types of economic growth have resulted in different changes in the labor market indicators. That are the questions that motivate this study. The analytical framework is that in any country, a policy action will take place and it will produce economic growth or will have an effect on other variables. And how that is going to impact poverty? Well, there are basically two channels. One channel is via employment, via the labor market, and the other is with social programs. So economic growth takes place, it could impact in employment or in social programs, and that is going to have an effect on poverty. What this book is about is the channel, the upper channel, is economic growth, employment, and poverty. So what is our output of this research? Well, we have 17 working papers, 16 country chapters for each one of the Latin American countries that we analyze, and one cross-country chapter in which we put together all the results for each country. And that is compiled into a book that is called The Growth Employment Poverty Nexus in Latin America. That has just been published in July. The data sources that we use is the data from household surveys that comes from CEDLAC. CEDLAC is an institute that compiles all household surveys in Latin America and harmonize them and make it comparable. So it's a very nice set of data, and it allow us to go very deep in defining the labor market indicators that we are going to use to evaluate this nexus, and on defining it in a comparable way that this has not been produced in any other study for this large set of indicators. So we are going to be looking to 16 countries. The period is from 2000 to 2013. So we look at a total of 150 household surveys that contain information about 5 million households and more than 80 million people. And this allows us to produce indicators that are comparable across countries, are comparable across times. And we are going to also be using some aggregate macroeconomic indicators from different sources. What are the labor market indicators? Well, we look at 16 labor market indicators, and we separate them between the employment and earnings indicators and poverty and inequality. In the employment and earnings indicators, we are going to be looking at the unemployment rate. We are going to be looking at the job mix of the economy, the sectoral composition of the economy, the occupational composition of the economy, the share of self-employment and wage salary employers and unpaid workers in the economy. And we are going to be looking at the share of workers with low or high educational level, defining low as primary education and high as tertiary education. And the category that is left out is the share of people with secondary education. We are going to be looking at the share of workers registered with the Social Security as well, thinking about the proxy of informality. And we are also going to be looking at the monthly labor earnings in each country, how the monthly labor earnings change. That with respect to the employment and earnings indicator and the indicators, and then we are going to be looking at the poverty rate for defined as $2.5 a day and $4 a day. And we are also going to be looking at inequality of household per capita income and inequality of labor earnings. So this is the set of 16 indicators, and what we are doing is we are defining with is the change that with what direction of the change in this indicator is going into the welfare improvement direction. So, for example, we are going to define that if unemployment decreases, that is a change in the labor market indicator that goes in the welfare improvement direction. the opposite will happen if there is an increase in monthly labor earnings. If it increases, then it moves in the welfare improvement direction. And what we create is a summary statistic, an index that summarizes the number of indicators in each country that move in the welfare improvement direction. That is the index C. So, yeah.
Go back to that. So on this, if somebody owns their own small business, they're not in.
So that is so the question was, if someone owns their own business, are they here? So what happened is that for each one of the job mix categories, we have one category that what we left out, because if we include it, it will increase automatically in one category and it will be a reduction in the other. So there is one category that is left out so that we can make this claim about welfare improvement or welfare worsening. And it's not clear if a change, if an increase in the proportion of people that own their own business is going to be a welfare improvement or a welfare worsening. So that's another reason why we left out that specific category. So, so we take it into account. It's not that we take it out of our sample, but it's not one of our 16 labor market indicators.
If I could just add, the real monthly labor earnings include the labor earnings of the self-employed as well as the labor earnings of wage and salaried employees. So they're included, they're just not their own category when it comes to the share of them.
Thank you, guys. So moving now to the change in labor market indicators and the rate of economic growth. So how labor market indicators change when there was economic growth? The first question that we are going to answer is, from beginning to end, how GDP per capita and labor market indicators change. The first thing that we are going to look at, what happened at the average level for all the region. So what happened in all the region is that GDP per capita increased. So these figures here are showing an index, are normalizing every series, taking the average to be 100. So you can take the difference between two extremes, and that's the percentage change in the series, in the GDP per capita. So GDP per capita increased around 30% during this period. Unemployment went down by around 20%. Monthly labor earnings first decline in the very first year of the 2000s, but then they increase. So overall, labor earnings increase as well.
She mentioned it's inflation adjusted.
Yeah, it's labor earnings in real terms, so it's inflation adjusted. And poverty, if you look at what happened to poverty, poverty for the average of the region went from 40% to 25%. So it's a very large decline in poverty. When we look at what happened from beginning to end to each country, we found that in each of the 16 Latin American countries that we evaluate, there has been economic growth. GDP per capita increase. Now that economic growth has been heterogeneous. We have some countries like Panama and Peru, for which the GDP per capita increased 5.6% a year. And there are other countries for which the GDP per capita increased in a much lower rate. So 1.7, 1.4, but this is still positive. On average, we found that during this period, the economic growth was 2.9% per year, and it was much higher than for the OECD and for the US for this period. What happened with the labor market indicators? Here we are showing the percentage of labor market indicators that improve for each country. So if we look at, the number of countries for which the percentage of labor market indicators that improve is higher than 60%. That is true for all the countries except for one, which is Honduras. So for most of the countries, most of the labor market indicators improve, change in the welfare improving direction. And if we put that barrier even higher, all but three have a more than 75% of increase in the labor market indicator. So it's a very positive story. Economic growth and a large improvement in almost all the labor market indicators. So the summary is in this section is that GDP per capita grew for the entire region. Real earnings increased, poverty declined, and unemployment declined, and most of the labor market indicators change in the welfare improvement direction for the entire region. And when we look at what happened for each particular country, for GDP per capita grew for all countries. Most employment and earnings indicators increase for the majority of the countries, except for one, that is the case of Honduras. Now, the question that we are going to try to answer now is, did countries that experience higher rate of economic growth have a larger improvement in the labor market indicators? So is the rate of economic growth related to how much the labor market indicators increase? And this graph is showing in the horizontal axis the percentage change in GDP per capita. So we see here, and in the vertical axis, the percentage of labor market indicators that move in the welfare improvement direction. And we see that when we look at the relationship between the economic growth and the percentage of labor market indicators that improve, the relationship is positive. But there is a lot of heterogeneity on this graph. So at the very top of the per capita growth, we have Peru and Panama, for which growth was very rapid and most of the labor market indicators improved. On the very left of this graph, we have Mexico, Salvador, Honduras, for which the growth rate was lower and a lower percentage of labor market indicators improved. So in the extremes, we have a relationship, but in the middle, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So we have Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay with low rate of economic growth and most of the labor market indicators improving. And we have Dominican Republic, Colombia, for which they have higher rate of economic growth and not that many of the labor market indicators improve. So a lot of heterogeneity going on in the region, especially for the countries that have that were in the middle range of economic growth. And that is true also if we look at each of the labor market indicators separately. So this is, for example, the relationship between the percentage increase in mean labor earnings. We find exactly the same. Countries at the very top have a positive increase. Countries at the very bottom of the rate of economic growth has a negative increase, a negative change in the labor market earnings, but in the middle, a lot of heterogeneity. If we look at poverty rate, we see that poverty declined for almost all countries except for Honduras and Dominican Republic. And we also see this negative relationship, but again, it's mostly driven by Panama and Peru and Mexico and El Salvador, and in the middle, there is a lot of things going on. For the only variable that we find a clear tight relationship with economic growth is for the share of workers registered with the Social Security system. And our interpretation of this graph is that when economic growth takes place, it may create the political space to implement reforms that allow workers to register in the Social Security system. And that was particularly true in the case of Dominican Republic and Ecuador. These were countries that reformed the Social Security system to increase the share of people registered on it. But it's curious that this is the only indicator that is related to economic growth in a very tight way. So the summary of the finding is that faster economic growth, if you will look at cross countries, there is a relationship. Countries that have faster economic growth have larger improvement in the labor market indicators, but their relationship is not tight. It's not very clear how much it's not very tight, that relationship. And the reason why it is not very tight is because the countries that experience middle rates of economic growth have very heterogeneous experience in terms of labor market indicators. So if it's not economic growth, what is it? That is our next question. What are the factors that are then creating this heterogeneity between countries? And we look to a different set of variables. We look at the initial GDP, thinking that maybe the poorest countries who are growing faster and are improving their labor market indicators faster, and we found no relationship. We look at the initial level of the labor market indicator, thinking that maybe if you start with a higher level of poverty, it's easier, or each percentage of economic growth is going to have a higher impact on poverty, and we found some relationship there. Countries who started in a higher level of poverty, they tend to reduce poverty faster for each unit of economic growth, and the same with unemployment. So there's some convergence in that sense. And we look at other macroeconomic variables to see if countries that experience commodity booms or countries that experience the booms of their exports were the countries that for which the labor market indicators improve the most. And we found some relationship that is not very clear. I'm going to show you some results about that. So what we conclude in that sense is that some macroeconomic variables are associated with changes in the labor market conditions during the 2000s, but it's not very clear. There is not a unique configuration of macroeconomic variables that will explain the changes in the labor market. It's not that the countries that invest for which the service sector expanded are the countries that show better labor market results. We found very heterogeneous experience, and our interpretation of this is that there is not silver bullet for development. There is not a silver bullet for development. One size doesn't fit all. So each country follows. Different countries are following different development strategies, and it worked for the majority of them. And let me show you some examples. So this is the relationship between the percentage of labor market indicators that improve and the share of exports in the right side of this figure, and the percentage changes in services in the left side of these figures. So it's true that in general, countries for which export increase the most are countries for which the labor market indicators improve the most. But if you look at Brazil and Paraguay in the right-hand side of the graph, the percentage of exports in terms of GDP didn't change at all. And these are countries for which most of the labor market indicators improve. And it's true that for Bolivia, the development strategy was to increase exports at 2% a year, and that worked for them. The labor market indicators, all the labor market indicators change in the welfare improvement direction. If you look at what happened with the percentage of the workforce in service, you will find that some countries like Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru, the workforce moved from service to manufacturing, and those countries experienced an increase of around 100% of the labor market indicators. But other countries like Panama and Costa Rica and Paraguay, they did the opposite. The increase were in services, and they also experienced a very remarkable improvement in the labor market indicators. So this is again consistent with the story that one size doesn't fit all.
Just so I'm clear, when you talk about services, you're talking about the share of GDP in terms of services?
Yeah, sorry. I think I say the share of the workforce, and it's the share of the GDP of services. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. So what we were thinking then is the link between growth and poverty is not very tight. But what about the link between employment and poverty? What happened when some of the employment indicators change? What happened with poverty? And that's where we are going to move now. Are larger improvement in employment and energy indicators associated with larger reductions in poverty? So let's first look at some correlations. Here, what I'm showing is when there is an increase in the mean labor earnings, what's the relationship of an increase in the mean labor earnings with a reduction in poverty? And what we found is that when countries have an increase in the mean labor earnings, countries also experience a decline in poverty. And that relationship is very tight. The correlation coefficient is 0.88%. If you look at unemployment, that relationship is not that tight. And in a way, it's consistent with the idea that Gary presented in the introduction, that one of the main problems of the developing countries is not an unemployment problem, it's the employment problem. It's an employment problem. People are working, but they are working in bad conditions. And in fact, we found much more higher correlation between reductions in poverty and decline and improvement in employment conditions than with a decline in unemployment. So we find a very tight correlation, for example, with the share of low earnings occupations. So when the share of low earnings occupations decline, that is related to a higher decline in poverty as well. So countries that experience a lower decline in agriculture and in low skilled services are also the countries that experience the higher decline in poverty. The relation with the inequality is also pretty tight. And here is that the countries that have the largest decline in inequality are also the countries that experience the largest decline in poverty. And let me show you one of those relationships. So this is the relationship between the annualized changes in labor earnings and annual labor earnings on the horizontal axis, and the changes in poverty on the vertical axis. So we see that all the countries lie in this line, in this very nice negative slope line here, indicating that those countries for which the labor earnings increase the most are also the countries for which the poverty rate decline the most as well. So it's a very positive story. All the countries in the right, in the right panel, right and low panel, are countries for which the main labor earnings increase and poverty decline. If we look at that relationship with some other labor market indicators, so this is, for example, the share of workers that are salary employees. We see again a very tight correlationship. Again, this positive story about a lot of countries reducing poverty and a lot of countries increasing the share of workers that are wage or salary employee, as opposed of self-employment and unpaid family worker. So that's why this is a positive change. This is a change in the welfare improvement direction of this labor market indicator. So then we look across countries. We found that there is a large association between improvement in earnings and employment indicators and reductions in poverty. That's the summary of what I just described. And now I want to move a little bit to look closer to what happened with labor earnings within each country. Why labor earnings? Well, because labor earnings are the main source of income for Latin American households. And that's what we care about it. We found that mean labor earnings increased in 11 countries and decreased in 5 countries. But we want to look more than just mean labor earnings. We want to know what happened to the whole wage distribution, what happened to the poorest percentile, what happened to the richest percentile. So what we do is we look at changes for each one of the deciles of the income distribution, ordering people in an anonymous, these are anonymous people, so we estimate the percentiles of the income distribution, the first decile, the second decile, the third decile at the beginning of the period. We look at what are their earnings. Then we look at the same at the end of the period, and we estimate the changes. And what we found is that for most of these deciles, for 70% of these deciles, there is an increase in labor market earnings. And most of the exceptions were in those 5 countries in which the mean labor earnings decline. And let me show you some examples of that. So this is what we call gross incidence curves. In the vertical axis is the percentage change in income, and in the horizontal axis is the different deciles of the income distribution. So in the case of Bolivia, for example, the first decile of the income distribution increased the labor earnings more than 90%. That's a very large change. The only caveat there is that these are people that were earning very little at the beginning. So in absolute terms, it's not that much, but in percentage terms, it's a lot. And when in the case of Bolivia and Brazil, the lower the percentile is, the higher the changes in the earnings were. So there is a very clear downward sloping, and this is an indicator that inequality also declined in that country. In Chile, we have also a downward sloping curve, and it doesn't seem to be that impressive, but it's still between 5 and 35%. That's a lot. That's still a lot. The thing is that Bolivia and Brazil were so impressive that they are changing how the figure is displayed. And then we have the case of Dominican Republic. In the case of Dominican Republic, for all the deciles, they experience a decline in the labor earnings. And we have 5 countries like Dominican Republic, and most of the negative change in for each of the deciles happen in those countries that experience something similar to Dominican Republic. For most of the countries for which the labor earnings increase, most of the deciles or all the deciles benefited from it. So there is an exception there. For example, Bolivia. In Bolivia, the only decile that experienced negative increase in the labor earnings is the richest decile. So very different to the story of the United States. If you were to plot this for the United States, it would be a very clear upward sloping curve. So what happened during the crisis? Were these countries resilient to the economic crisis? And we found that yes, that in general, the crisis have a very low impact on these countries. And what most of the country did, and that's what I want you to pay attention to, is that they implemented countercyclical policies, especially expanding their social programs during these times. So if we were to look at how different variables evolved during this time and what happened during the crisis, unemployment increased between 2008 and 2009, but poverty kept declining. And GDP also declined, but then it recovered very quickly, very, very quickly. I'm going to go back again at the end on this story about the implementation of social programs during that time. So if we were to look at how many of the labor market indicators were affected by the crisis, we see that most of the labor market indicators were not affected at all by the crisis. They continue to decline. Some labor market indicators declined during the crisis, and by 2012, they have a total recovery. They could recover the level before the crisis, the 2008 level. Some very small number of labor market indicators, and for very specific countries, are worse in 2012 than they were in 2008. And those are concentrated especially on Honduras. So Honduras is the exception of the rule of what was going on in Latin America during this period. And thinking about, so our period of analysis was 2000 to 2012. And of course, a lot of things have happened in Latin America since that period. So we have a very positive story up to 2012, but there is new data coming out that shows that the inequality stopped declining and now is increasing a little bit in the last few years. And poverty also, the changes in poverty have reached a plateau, and it's becoming more and more hard for Latin American countries to reduce poverty. And here we see that GDP was still increasing, but if we were to plot 2015 and 2016, there it's actually now is completely flat. So the very positive story in the 2000, the question that raises is, are Latin American countries able to replicate what happened in the 2000s in the next decade after 2015, 2016? And in part of some of the countries for which the poverty has declined less and they have a higher economic crisis were countries that were implementing some countercyclical reforms in 2009. And what they implemented some social programs that were aimed to be temporary, and once implemented, they couldn't take it out. They couldn't go back to the original level. And what happened is that they generate fiscal crisis in those countries. And those countries are Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. Part of it is the fiscal crisis, and part of it is also the political crisis in each of these countries. So to conclude, the original question was, has economic growth resulted in economic development via improved in labor market conditions in Latin America in the 2000s? Have these improvements halted or reversed since the Great Recession of 2008? And what's the relationship between labor market indicators, poverty, and inequality? So what we found is a very positive region for the region as a whole during these years. GDP per capita grew, all employment and earnings indicators increased, and poverty and inequality fell. And when we look country by country, the same story, the same positive story is repeated country by country, with one exception, that is Honduras. And what we found is when we look at what are the sources of this large improvement in labor market indicators, we found that there is a weekly relationship between the changes in labor market indicators and economic growth. And the tightest relationship that we found is actually the changes in the employment and unemployment indicators with poverty. So it seems that countries that were successful in reducing poverty were countries in which the employment, the labor market improved or changed in the welfare improvement direction. And to conclude, there is a book by Bourguignon in 2003 that talks about the poverty, growth, and inequality. And I would like to read you a script of that book. He found that there is no clear relationship between poverty, growth, and inequality. And what he says is, do these results imply that growth has no significant impact on distribution? Certainly not. They simply mean that there is too much country specificity in the way growth may affect distribution for any generalization to be possible. That's also consistent with our story that one size doesn't fit all. Indeed, case studies show that distributional changes in a given country have much to do with the pace and structural features of economic growth in the period under analysis. What we are bringing into the picture now is that is mediated through labor markets. Labor markets are the link between growth and poverty. And that's where the countries should put the focus on improving labor market conditions, thinking that is going to be what is going to drive reductions in poverty. And just to finish, some additional material. There's a video of the conference that we gave in Wider in the internet. There's going to be another video of this conference. Also, the series of paper can be consulted at Wider, and the book, something that I forgot to mention, is open access, so you can download it for free. Thank you.